To the barricades.
That was number one on the list of recruiting tactics.
Good man.
Friends, welcome to Brigham Young University. We're glad to welcome you tonight for this keynote address by Dr. Thomas Kidd, Research Professor of Church History at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm Spencer Fluman. I'm the chair of the BYU History Department and one of the co-organizers of this event. This event helps us kick off our Religion and the American Founding Conference today and tomorrow. This two-day event explores religion and the founding as part of our semi-quincentennial year of celebration and remembrance and education. I'd like to recognize tonight Chris Stevenson, the other co-organizer of this event, who is the president and co-founder of the National Museum of American Religion. Grateful to have the museum as our institutional partner. I'll say more about the conference in a moment, but as with all events that we have at BYU, we're going to begin this evening with a prayer. That prayer tonight is going to be offered by Mia Porter, a junior at BYU from California who is studying business. Mia?
Our dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to be gathered here today. We're so grateful for our country and for the many blessings that living here provides us, and we're grateful for faith and for the freedom that we have to practice our faith here as well, and for the unity that offers us as well. We're so grateful to be able to learn more about how religion has impacted our country today, and we're grateful for our speaker, Dr. Kidd, and for his time and consideration in being here tonight. Please bless him and his family and help us to be able to take something valuable from what he says tonight and to be able to use that to better ourselves and to better our country. We're so grateful for our many blessings, and please help us to be able to bless those around us as well. Please bless those that are here tonight as well as those that couldn't make it, and please bless that we all be able to enjoy the rest of our evening and continue in safety and in good health. We love thee when we see these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Mia. We're marking 250 years since the Declaration of Independence by bringing historians and archivists and the general public together to consider together ways that religious ideas, institutions, and people influenced and were influenced by the American founding. The conference grows out of a partnership between many institutions, and we're grateful to all those who have helped make it possible. Tonight's keynote address, for instance, is sponsored by the BYU Wheatley Institute, so we're grateful for Dr. Paul Edwards and those who work with him to making this possible. We'd also like to recognize major funding for this conference provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Clements Family Foundation. We could not have done this without their generous support. On the screen behind me, yep, there it is, appearing magically, it gives you a sense of the kind of broad collaboration that we've gathered together to bring this conference about. It's remarkable. In the end, we hope that you all come away with a deepened sense of how religious people, religious institutions, and religious ideas figure in that broader story of our national founding. We're pleased now to hear a welcome to the conference from Utah Governor Spencer Cox. It's a recorded message. We're grateful for him to do that. After his remarks, we'll welcome to the podium Dr. Patrick Mason, the Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture at Utah State University, who will introduce our speaker.
On July 4th, 1837, at the dedication of a battlefield monument to fallen revolutionaries at Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo On July 4th, 1837, at the dedication of a battlefield monument to fallen revolutionaries at Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo's now famous Concord hymn was first sung. The same verses which urged Americans to remember the shot heard round the world also address the spirit that made those heroes dare to die and leave their children free. But what was that spirit? For many, it was a religious conviction that both God's law and natural law necessitated resistance against a tyrannical government. One thing we know for sure, religion played a profound role in creating the conditions possible for American independence. It is a great privilege to welcome you to the convening of this conference on religion and the founding of America, graciously hosted by Brigham Young University here in the great state of Utah. It is my hope that as you discuss the ways in which religious belief contributed to the formation of our nation in all its beauty and complexity, that you will also take some time to reflect on how religion may yet contribute to our country's continuing journey to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, as penned by Thomas Jefferson 250 years ago. Thank you, God bless you, and enjoy the conference.
I think this is officially the first time I've followed the governor. There will not be any technical difficulties with my remarks. I want to start, before I offer a formal introduction of Dr. Kidd, I want to offer something of a preface that I think may help frame who he is as a scholar and as a person. A quarter century ago, Tommy Kidd and I were graduate students taking part in an experiment. We weren't working with lab rats or guinea pigs. We were the guinea pigs. In 1997, George Marsden, one of the nation's preeminent historians of religion, published a book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. He was responding to a trend in postmodern scholarship that embraced various points of view based on an author's race, class, or gender, but which considered the perspectives of believing Christians to be either irrelevant or even antithetical to serious academic thinking. Outrageous Idea made a big splash at the time, and it's still worth reading. Actually, a second edition just came out a couple of years ago. But Marsden didn't just wait for the rest of the academy to respond to his earnest pleas. He took things into his own hands. As one of the senior members of the history department at the University of Notre Dame, he embarked on a deliberate strategy beginning in the late 1990s to prioritize accepting students of faith into the graduate program. The majority were, like Marsden, evangelical Protestants, but it being Notre Dame, there were also plenty of good Catholics as well. Thomas Kidd entered the program in 1998 and was a star student from the beginning. A year later, Marsden did something even more radical. He rolled the dice on a couple of Latter-day Saints, including me. It was as if he was asking, just how far can I push this whole religion gets a seat at the table thing? Marsden knew relatively little about Mormonism. What he did know, he generally disagreed with, theologically speaking. But his generosity opened the door for many of us, Latter-day Saint historians, to begin our careers at the intersections of history and faith. Not only myself, but also people like Matthew Groh, who's currently the managing director of the LDS Church History Department. So all of this is prelude to me doing my real job tonight, which is to introduce our guest speaker. I knew Thomas Kidd even before he was Dr. Thomas Kidd. We went to lots of Notre Dame football games together. This was in the dark ages of Bob Davie. We ate way too much Burger King in the Student Center together. But more than being friends, Thomas, or Tommy, as we all knew him back then, was one of my academic heroes. Even as a second-year graduate student, a year ahead of me, he already had an impressive command of the history and historiography. His readings of texts in seminar were always incisive. I deeply admired his work ethic and tried to pattern my own off of it. Tommy treated graduate school like the job that it was. He clocked in early, he worked hard all day. He got more accomplished in a day's work than anyone else I know. All that laid the foundation for an enormously successful career. Put simply, Thomas Kidd is one of the most prolific and respected scholars of American religion in the entire country. Thomas Kidd holds the John and Sharon Yeats Endowed Chair of Baptist Studies at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where he's a research professor of church history. Prior to his appointment at Midwestern, he was on the faculty at Baylor University for many years. He teaches courses on colonial America, the American Revolution, American religious history, and a number of other topics. He's the author of numerous books, by my count, 12 in the past 18 years, but I could be missing one or two. He's probably got to correct the record on that. He has terrific religious biographies of founding fathers Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Patrick Henry, and a whole wide range of other topics in the history of Christianity and early American religious history. Not confined to the academy, he maintains an active social media presence and also writes for a number of media outlets informing the broader public. I save for last the most important things. As dedicated as Dr. Kidd is to the highest standards of academic scholarship, he's even more dedicated to his family and his faith. This is not just a cliche. Nothing is more important to Professor Kidd than his Christian faith and discipleship. He's actively involved in his local Baptist church, and he left Baylor for Midwestern in large part because he wanted to be part of training the next generation of Baptist clergy. In a time when so much of faith has been captured by politics, Kidd remains a clarion voice for the independence and faithfulness of the church. He's a dedicated family man. One of the great joys of my graduate school years was seeing Tommy find Ruby and then attending their wedding. Since then, they've welcomed 2 boys into their home, and you won't go long without hearing him talk about his family. In short, when I grow up, I want to be a little bit more like Thomas Kidd. Please join me in welcoming him to this conference.
Well, that was a humdinger of an introduction, man. I mean, whew, not too many lies detected, Patrick. All right. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to Spencer and Chris for organizing this conference. Thank you to the donors and the many sponsors of this extraordinary event. And I'm so glad to be a part of it. It's honestly one of the great honors of my career to be asked to give this keynote address. There is no more controversial historical topic today than the role of faith in the American founding. Most of the myths about religion and the founding are a result of partisan and polemical views of the founding, which tend to create selective history. On one side in this debate, we have secularists who tell us that Christianity had virtually nothing to do with the American founding, and that the founders were all deists, if not closet atheists. On the other side, we have advocates of a thoroughly Christian founding who imply that virtually all the founders, including improbable candidates such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, were indeed born-again Christians who explicitly founded America as a Christian nation. The problem is that partisan history is almost always bad history by definition. Too often on both the activist left and right, we see people who use history to make contemporary political points that, if we were honest, they were going to make anyway. And so instead of illuminating the strangeness of the past, partisan history is really often just ahistorical. It tends to assume that the past is basically the same as today, and that the past is mainly valuable as ammunition in today's culture wars. This means, for the partisan historian or history writer, that the past should and must bolster current agendas and alignments, including on religion. But historical reality is more complex. It's always more complex, and it's often more surprising. The reality about the founding is that religion played an extremely important role in the American founding, but not because the founding fathers were all in accord in their personal beliefs about Jesus, the Bible and salvation. One of the ways that religion played an essential role in the Revolution was the constant appeal during the Revolution to divine blessing on the founders' endeavors. The Patriots were quick to seek divine approval of the Revolution, and not least in Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. This year, of course, marks the 250th anniversary of independence, which Congress approved on July 2nd, 1776, and then they passed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. And as you know, the Declaration memorably argued that, quote, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration represented America's great leap into the unknown of separation from Great Britain. To ensure that the document's message resonated with American colonists, Jefferson and the Continental Congress urgently needed an appeal to divine warrant for independence. They sought to put the argument in theological terms that were both broad and bracing. They certainly did not want to set off any kind of sectarian controversy over what the Declaration said about God, but they also didn't want to make the language so generic that it lacked persuasive power. We might compare the Declaration of Independence to the comparatively vague Virginia Declaration of Rights penned by George Mason, a pluralistically minded Anglican, which the Virginia Convention had adopted on June 12, 1776, so just about 4 weeks earlier. The Virginia Declaration reaches the same conclusion about human equality as does the Declaration of Independence, but in language that was more vague and philosophical. It asserted that, quote, all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. It doesn't quite have the same oomph as the Declaration does. And I think the reason for that is because its lack of theological language. So while Jefferson and Mason may have meant effectively the same thing, and I think they did, Jefferson's language of equality by the self-evident truth of common creation and God-given rights was simply more powerful. Jefferson did not employ theological language to reflect his own religious devotion, however. Reared in the Anglican Church, Jefferson already seems to have doubted basic Christian doctrine by the mid-1770s. His skepticism became more pronounced by the late 1780s, when, for example, he compared the Bible's miracles to similar episodes from Roman mythology. In a letter written in 1825, however, Jefferson explained that the Declaration was not seeking, quote, originality of principle or sentiment. Instead, he wrote, it was intended to be an expression of the American mind, and to give to that expression the proper tone and spirit called for by the occasion. All its authority, he said, rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day. Love that phrase, harmonizing sentiments of the day. He wasn't looking to say anything that would cause exasperation among patriots, at least not about the appeal to divine sanction. The mere argument for independence was controversial enough. The proper tone would assert that independence was justified because God had given Americans rights that no person, including King George III, could justly violate. So Jefferson focused on harmonizing sentiments that could unify those who agreed that independence was necessary despite the gravity of the decision. Those sentiments called forth the language of creation. The Declaration also opened with an appeal to divine sanction and its assertion that there was a, quote, separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled a people pursuing independence. Here, Jefferson was suggesting that there was a created order which justified a periodic return to man's state of nature, a time prior to the creation of government in which humans were separate and equal. Many have understandably focused on the deistic implications of the phrase nature and nature's God. Jefferson surely had doubts about a meticulously providential God who was involved in the everyday affairs of men. But Jefferson's God, and he did believe in God, was discoverable by reason and by the order of creation. To Jefferson, people stood equal before God because they equally came from God as the creator. Jefferson had many reservations about Christian doctrine specifically, but his views of the created order, I think, were fairly conventional in 1776. The Continental Congress believed that Jefferson's draft of the Declaration was headed in the right direction. But as they edited the Declaration, they ended it with final appeals to divine warrant. Jefferson had grounded the case for equality and rights in common creation by God and the God-given natural order. But the document had moved on from the topic of divine approval when Jefferson addressed the long, quote, history of repeated injuries and usurpations of the British against the American colonists. Members of Congress wanted to return to the theme of God's sanction at the end of the document. And this resulted in the document's most direct comment on God's judgment, when the Declaration said that the delegates appealed to, quote, the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. And finally, the delegates professed, quote, a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence in their endeavors. Appeals to divine providence were ubiquitous in the American Revolution, but they didn't stop reformers and critics from asking tough questions about the implication of equality by common creation. Most obviously, anti-slavery advocates asked, how could patriots claim to be concerned about liberty when they denied freedom of self-determination to enslaved people? Perhaps the most trenchant anti-slavery argument came from the militiaman and former indentured servant Lemuel Haynes of Massachusetts. Haynes would receive Congregationalist ordination in 1785, becoming the first black ordained pastor in the United States. Haynes wrote the unpublished manuscript Liberty Further Extended in 1776 as a direct response to the Declaration of Independence and its appeal to divine sanction for American liberty. Liberty Further Extended conspicuously quoted the Declaration's statement that all men are created equal on its title page, leaving no doubt that Haynes was responding to the Declaration's notion of equality by God's common creation. Haynes further extended the case for American liberty by taking equality by creation to its logical conclusion. Quote, liberty is a jewel which was handed down to man from the cabinet of heaven, Haynes wrote. It proceeded from the supreme legislature of the universe, so it is he, God, which hath a sole right to take away. Blacks and whites, he said, were of the same human species, and all were created in the same way by God. Their desire for liberty was a commonly shared principle and a, quote, law of nature. Therefore, he said, liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. A petition by slaves to the Massachusetts legislature made virtually the same argument in 1777. They contended, these slaves did, that they, quote, have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind. The appeal to divine approval could have unexpected applications when put in the hands of those with qualms about slavery. A state court ruling effectively ended slavery in Massachusetts in 1781, but it would prove difficult, of course, to abolish slavery in the states further south, where the institution was more central to the economy, like in states like Jefferson's Virginia. Patriot appeals to divine sanction then were not conversation stoppers. Both pervasive and provocative, they were as likely to generate debate as consensus. One's response to the appeal to divine sanction did not simply depend on which side of the revolution you were on, although partisan alignments obviously did make a difference. But it would be difficult to imagine Americans in 1776, or in virtually any American war, not making at least generic appeals to God's blessing. The human and material sacrifices of war demand higher justifications than an unwillingness to pay taxes. Invoking the Creator, the supreme judge of the world, and divine providence also did not necessarily mean that those appealing to God were devout Christians. Many rank and file patriots were indeed traditional Christians, but several of the top-tier founders, including Jefferson, were not. Other founders, such as Washington and Madison, were generally quite reticent about their own personal beliefs. Washington, as we've already heard tonight, in particular, regularly discussed the public importance and value of religion, most notably in his 1796 farewell address. But Washington was rigidly guarded about his own faith, and he seems clearly to have made a personal decision never to use the name Jesus or Christ in all of his vast body of writings and correspondence. So you really have to go to tier 1B of the founders to get to people who we can confidently describe as traditional Christians who believed in historic small o Orthodox Christian doctrine. These included figures such as Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, John Jay of New York, and Elias Boudinot of New Jersey. These were very important figures in their own right, but probably did not rank among the 5 or 6 founders who will get the most attention this anniversary year. Even among the major founders, however, we regularly encounter religious patterns and combinations that are unlike anything we would expect to encounter today. Take Benjamin Franklin, for example, the subject of one of my biographies of the founders. Franklin grew up in a Puritan family in Boston, and accordingly, he knew the text of the King James Bible better than almost any other founder, and certainly knew it the best of the major 5 or 6 founders. Yet by his teenage years, Franklin had become a self-described deist, and perhaps the most skeptical of the major founders, except perhaps for his protege, Thomas Paine. However, Franklin the deist increasingly believed in God's providential superintending role over history, which helps explain the otherwise inexplicable moment at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 when Franklin, of all people, proposed that the convention begin opening its sessions with prayer. Even stranger, Franklin the deist was one of the only delegates who supported the prayer motion, which was tabled, much to Franklin's frustration. Thomas Jefferson likewise denied the doctrine of the Trinity, which is the traditional Christian belief that one true God exists eternally in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Jefferson denied that. He denied the doctrine of the resurrection. He denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. Yet Jefferson was fascinated with, and even, I think, consumed with the Bible and with the person of Jesus in particular. Jefferson read and studied the Bible regularly, even while he was the President of the United States. And he regularly read the Greek New Testament in Greek and the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible. And by 1803, Jefferson even came to refer to himself as a Christian. We'll see more about that in a minute, but unlike Franklin, Jefferson did not call himself a deist. But again, as we will see, Jefferson attached a specific and idiosyncratic meaning to the term Christian, one that few Orthodox Christians would ever affirm. But my point here, and my point for much of the rest of this talk, is you don't probably know people like Jefferson today. He's a fairly rigid skeptic who nevertheless is so fascinated with Jesus that he bothered to compose two versions of the Gospels for himself over the course of more than 15 years. And that is what we generally refer to as the Jefferson Bible. The Jefferson Bible. So for the next few moments, I want to move beyond the Revolutionary War, beyond the Declaration and the Constitution, and into the early 1800s to consider Jefferson's late in life commitment to Unitarian theology and his composition of two versions of what we call the Jefferson Bible, the most famous and controversial edition of the Gospels in American history. Along the way, I hope we'll gather a deeper appreciation for the important yet unfamiliar role that religion and Christianity specifically played in Jefferson's beliefs and that of the founding generation. And much of what I say here is covered at greater depth in my book on Jefferson. The months before and after the 1803 Louisiana Purchase witnessed the most decisive season of religious reflection in Thomas Jefferson's life. This is his first term as president. And he had regularly thought about religious and ethical matters since his time as a student at William and Mary, but he had never formed a definite theological position. His eclectic strains of Epicurean and small R Republican and Christian thought had never really crystallized into a personal creed until 1803. And the reasons why 1803 and 04 became so decisive for Jefferson they're just unclear. Why really does anyone go through a spiritual or intellectual transformation at the specific time that they do? Many people, including me, experience their most decisive changes in early adulthood, as was the case for Jefferson's fellow skeptic, Franklin. Jefferson's moment of religious commitment came much later in his life. By 1804, the 61-year-old concluded that Jesus' ethical teachings were the, quote, most benevolent and sublime ever known to humankind. They were superior to all others, and this was the basis upon which Jefferson concluded that he was a Christian, or a Christian rationally understood. Now, Jefferson had gone through seasons of severe stress in his life before, most obviously in the death of his wife Martha in 1782 and the political crises of the 1790s, which were nasty. The furor of the 1790s had abated little in Jefferson's first term as president. And if anything, criticisms against him in 1800 became more bitter and more focused on his alleged atheism. In 1802, Thomas Paine returned to America after a lengthy tenure in Europe, giving Federalist or anti-Jeffersonian newspapers fresh opportunity to associate Jefferson with the most notorious anti-Christian critic among the major founders, Paine. Jefferson must have also been horrified by public allegations about his relationship with Sally Hemings, one of his slaves, who he was alleged, and I think quite plausibly, based on what we know now, that he had a long-term sexual relationship with Sally Hemings. Those charges began to appear in newspapers in 1802. Jefferson would never address those charges directly. He didn't have to. We didn't have CNN, Fox News back in those days. But they may have made him anxious to present himself as a supporter of Christian morality in the eyes of friends and in those of his daughters in particular, Martha Jr. and Mary. He was worried about what they thought about him. Jefferson's relationships with peers, including Benjamin Rush and Joseph Priestley, gave him essential resources, I think, to craft a rationalist, ethics-focused version of Christianity that he could defend intellectually. And by 1800, Benjamin Rush, who was a Philadelphia physician and Patriot leader, had planted the notion in Jefferson's mind that true Christianity was uniquely suited to small r republicanism, Republican political thought. And then in 1803, Jefferson read the English scientist and minister Joseph Priestley's Unitarian tract called Socrates and Jesus Compared. And this tract explained why Jesus' ethics possessed, quote, infinite superiority, as Priestley put it, to ancient pagan philosophy like that of Socrates. Priestley believed that Jesus' preternatural teaching authority originated in divine revelation. But those claims didn't interest Jefferson so much as Jesus' teachings themselves. As Priestley noted, Jesus' universal mandate to love your neighbor in particular, in the Greek it's that agape love ethic, represented, Jefferson said following Priestley, a purer and more sublime morality respecting God and man than any heathen could have a just idea of. That's the ancient heathen Greeks and Romans. Meanwhile, the president wrote to Priestley and told him that in light of Socrates and Jesus Compared and his conversations with Benjamin Rush, he, Jefferson, had begun to outline his own, quote, view of the Christian system. Jefferson proposed to evaluate ancient pagan philosophers, such as the Stoic Epicurus, and the ethics of the Jews, quote unquote, showing their strengths and deficiencies. This would allow him, Jefferson, to project Jesus as the preeminent ethical teacher who inculcated the, quote, principles of a pure deism. So there's Jefferson using the word deism. There he just means religion in its simplest form, especially belief in one God. Anyway, Jesus inculcated the principles of a pure deism and juster notions of the attributes of God to reform their moral doctrines to the standard of reason, justice, and philanthropy. Jefferson told another correspondent that, quote, Jesus embraced with charity and philanthropy our neighbors, our countrymen, and the whole family of mankind. Unlike Priestley, Jefferson said he would, quote, purposely omit the question of Jesus's divinity and even of his inspiration. Jefferson says, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not even interested in the question of his divinity. Jefferson noted that the biblical records of Jesus' life were imperfect and incomplete because, he said, they were recalled by flawed men long after they heard the master teach. Quote, yet such are the fragments remaining as to show a master workman, the president surmised. The Gospels, he said, still captured the moral brilliance of Jesus' teaching. So, during the extraordinary month of April 1803, Jefferson was sufficiently motivated to write down a, quote, syllabus of an estimate of the merit of the doctrines of Jesus compared with those of others. And he showed this syllabus to Benjamin Rush and others whose opinion he valued, reminding Rush of delightful personal conversations they had had in the 1790s about Christianity. He assured the doctor that the views expressed in the syllabus were, quote, very different from that anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. Jefferson then offered the most succinct statement of faith that he ever made. I am a Christian, he said, in the only sense in which he, Jesus, wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, ascribing to himself
every human excellence and believing he never claimed any other. You can make of that what you want. But Jefferson was saying that he was a rationalist and ethical Christian, opposing the, quote, corruptions of Christianity imposed by the priests of Jesus. Jefferson embraced the genuine precepts, he said, of Jesus himself. So Jefferson sent the syllabus to Joseph Priestley, Benjamin Rush, to his daughters, and to others. And the syllabus began by considering great ancient philosophers, including Socrates, Epicurus, and Seneca. He admitted that he still admired those philosophers' teachings on the passions and on tranquility, but they focused too much on the interior life. Quote, in developing our duties to others, they were short and defective. Still less have they inculcated peace, charity, and love to our fellow men, or embraced with benevolence the whole family of mankind. Jews, he said, advanced a true idea of one God, but their ideas about their God, Jefferson said, were, quote, degrading and injurious. So Jesus entered the Jewish milieu as a great reformer. Jesus operated under manifest disadvantages, Jefferson thought, including his Jewish context, his lack of education, and the fact that he passed on his teachings to, quote, the most unlettered and ignorant of men. That's the apostles. One of Jefferson's correspondents suggested that he moderate this characterization of the gospel writers a little bit and call them, quote, men of but little literary information. It's hilarious. But anyway, Jefferson saw Jesus' teachings still as the most perfect and sublime that has ever been taught. The records we have of those teachings, he emphasized, are, quote, defective and underdeveloped. That's the Gospels. Jesus only had 3 years to develop his philosophy before his tragic death. He did not record his teachings personally, and, quote, fragments only of what he did deliver have come to us, mutilated, misstated, and often unintelligible, end quote. The gospel accounts, Jefferson wrote, quote, have been still more disfigured by the corruptions of schismatizing followers who altered the simple purity of Jesus' philosophy for other ends. Jefferson later exclaimed that money-grubbing priests had adulterated Jesus' teachings, quote, by artificial constructions into a mere contrivance to filch wealth and power to themselves. Those corruptors, he said, were the real Antichrist. Jefferson explained that, quote, the question of his being a member of the Godhead, the Trinity, or in direct communication with it, claimed for him by some of his followers and denied by others, is foreign to the present view, not interested. He knew that he and Priestley did not agree about Jesus' divine mission, and Jefferson told Priestley as much when he sent him his copy of the syllabus. Jefferson's interest in Jesus was merely ethical. It was in Jesus', quote, universal philanthropy to all mankind that he found the, quote, peculiar superiority of the system of Jesus. He did concede that a, quote, future state was essential to Jesus' teachings as a chief incentive to moral behavior. Jefferson had hoped that Joseph Priestley would do more to assess Jesus' teachings in their ancient context and to produce an edited version of the Gospels with only Jesus' authentic precepts included. But Joseph Priestley died in February 1804, depriving Jefferson of his most influential religious interlocutor. So Jefferson's fascination with Jesus also led him to produce the first version of the Jefferson Bible. He reckoned that he could mine the Gospels for the real teachings of Jesus. Now, biblical scholars have fought many wars since Jefferson's time about the reliability of the Gospels in the Bible, but Jefferson was confident that distinguishing Jesus' true words in the New Testament was like picking out, quote, diamonds in a dunghill. Jesus' true teachings were the diamonds, the rest of the New Testament's the dunghill. Sometime during February and March 1804, he cut and pasted his compilation of the Gospels, only in English this time, onto blank sheets and had them bound into a volume. He recalled later that he did the work in, quote, 1 or 2 evenings only while I lived at Washington, overwhelmed with other business. And we might say, yeah, you were the President of the United States, and this is what you're doing at night. It's unbelievable. Anyway, the text of the first Jefferson Bible, unfortunately, is lost. But we do have the title page. He titled it, The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, being an abridgment of the New Testament for the use of the Indians. Given his interest in Indian missions, languages, and education, Jefferson might indeed have hoped that the volume would introduce some Native Americans to authentic rationalist Christianity. Maybe. Some scholars, however, have posited that, quote, Indians was a code word for his Federalist enemies, who said that he was an atheist. In any case, he told John Adams later that he made the philosophy of Jesus for his, quote, own use, and that he regarded the 46-page volume as a distillation of Jesus's, quote, pure and unsophisticated doctrines, such as were professed and acted on by the unlettered apostles, the apostolic fathers, and the Christians of the first century. So it was an attempt, he thought, at recovering true Christian teaching. Years later, Jefferson still told correspondents about the, quote, wee little book he pasted together in 1804. It is a paradigma of his doctrines, Jesus' doctrines, made by cutting the text out of the book and arranging them on the pages of a blank book. A more beautiful or precious morsel of ethics I have never seen. And he presented the philosophy of Jesus as, quote, proof that I am a real Christian, underlined real Christian. That is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus, very different from the Platonists, which is a really bad word for Jefferson, the Platonists who call me infidel. This morsel of ethics, along with the syllabus, encapsulated Jefferson's beliefs. And with the gospel compilation complete, his religious pilgrimage had arrived, I think, at its destination. In retirement, he would flesh out his beliefs with correspondence now including his fellow Unitarian John Adams, who became his most engaging conversation partner on religion after Benjamin Rush and Joseph Priestley. Aided by this small letter-writing community, Jefferson had settled upon an intellectually satisfying version of Christianity. Now, let's fast forward to the late 18-teens when Jefferson produced a second compilation of the Gospels, which he called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Because this text has survived and the other one didn't, this is usually what people mean when they speak of the Jefferson Bible. The Jefferson Bible was only known to a small circle of Jefferson's friends during his lifetime. He never did publish it during his life. Today, the cut and paste compilation has taken on a level of exposure that Jefferson would have never expected. The Smithsonian acquired it from a Jefferson descendant in 1895, long after Jefferson's death, and then the U.S. government published it in 1904. Then in 2011, the National Museum of American History restored the original volume, which allowed for the creation of a new, beautifully crafted facsimile. It's one of my favorite books I've got in my library. We don't know as much about when Jefferson created Life and Morals as we do about the philosophy of Jesus from 1803, but we know much more obviously about the text because it survived. In Life and Morals, Jefferson literally cut out gospel passages, not just from English editions this time, but from Greek, Latin, French, and English editions of the New Testament. He bought a lot of Bible-related books and he cut them all up in tatters and everything. So it's not so much that he cut out the supernatural elements of the Gospels, but that they were left behind in all these busted up, gutted editions. This Jefferson Bible included more content overall than the philosophy did, focusing on Jesus' life as well as his teachings. Scholars routinely note that Jefferson removed the miraculous content from the Gospels, and that was true in many cases. And as one scholar of the Jefferson Bible has observed, Jefferson's approach has the curious effect of presenting the gospel accounts of Jesus with, quote, all setup and no payoff. Most importantly, the Jefferson Bible ends with Jesus' death and burial. The last verse he included was from Matthew 27, where the disciples, quote, rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. That's it. That's the last phrase of the book. There is no resurrection. There's no ascension to heaven. It is easy, though, to overstate just how naturalistic Jefferson's extracts were. If you read the whole thing, it includes passages dealing with the last days, with the coming great tribulation for God's people. It includes a fiery hell. It includes a future resurrection of humankind and the second coming of the Son of Man. And Jefferson's Jesus also sometimes has special foreknowledge of future events. So why Jefferson included this supernatural material in his compilation is not clear. Maybe he found those parts somewhat plausible. Maybe he found it difficult to adhere strictly to naturalism, since, as you know, the Gospels weave in many supernatural happenings along with Jesus' ethical teachings. Or maybe Jefferson just didn't think about the choices as much as we might expect. The opening page of the clippings illustrates Jefferson's approach, and I encourage you to look at it. He started with Luke chapter 2, the narrative of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. He skipped the angel Gabriel's announcement to the Virgin Mary that Jesus would be miraculously conceived by the Holy Spirit. He also excised Luke 2, 8 through 20, regarding the angel's appearance to the shepherds, announcing the birth of the Messiah and exclaiming, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. So we would have sort of a limited Christmas celebration, if we, in Jefferson's version. But Jefferson did not cut out all references to angels. For example, he included Jesus' teaching in Matthew 13 that, quote, the Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire, and there shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Presumably he included this passage because it was part of Jesus' explanation of a parable. Jefferson tended to include parables, even if they contained material he might consider objectionable or unreliable. But he steered away from narratives in which supernatural beings were part of the action. The parables, the Sermon on the Mount, and similar passages were key because they demonstrated Jefferson believed the kind of moral behavior that God required for salvation. In contrast to the classic Protestant belief in salvation by grace alone, Jefferson believed that God would save people who behave morally. And he thought that was much more straightforward than, for instance, what Calvinists taught. And by the end of Jefferson's life, sometimes it seems like basically his concerns about Christian doctrine is really just opposition to Calvinism. He one time told a Philadelphia pastor, quote, you are a Calvinist. I am not. I am a sect by myself, as far as I know. A great quote. Jefferson regarded himself as a sect by himself because he didn't even agree with all of Jesus's teachings, even when reconstructed in their purity. He wrote to his longtime friend, William Short, in 1820, around when Jefferson was finishing The Life and Morals. And Jefferson said that he hoped to separate, quote, the gold from the dross in the Gospels and restore to Jesus the former and leave the latter, the dross, to the stupidity of some and roguery of others. Composing the gospel extracts also gave Jefferson a fresh opportunity to assess what he accepted in Jesus' authentic teachings and what he did not. Jefferson assumed there must be some content in the Gospels that represented Jesus' actual philosophy. He didn't think it was all invented later by others. Sending William Short a copy of his syllabus, he told Short that, quote, it is not to be understood that I am with him, Jesus, in all his doctrines. Jefferson, for example, considered himself a materialist, and he assumed that Jesus was a spiritualist. In other words, that Jesus believed that there existed a non-material realm of spirit. Pretty standard Christian stuff. But within months of explaining that contrast to Short, Jefferson speculated that maybe even Jesus was a materialist. Sure, he told John Adams, Jesus had said that God was a spirit in John 4, a verse that he included in Life and Morals. But Jesus didn't say that spirit wasn't material. It's ludicrous, but that's what Jefferson said. Anyway, Jefferson also noted that Jesus preached repentance for the forgiveness of sins, while Jefferson focused on good works as a counterpoise to sins. So forgiveness versus kind of a balanced view. But still, he regarded Jesus' distillation of the greatest commandments as, quote, the sum of all religion. As taught by its, quote, best preacher, those commandments were to fear God and love thy neighbor. Such teachings, he said, involved no mystery. They need no explanation. As for Jesus' divinity, Jefferson told William Short that he was convinced, quote, that Jesus did not mean to impose himself on mankind as the Son of God, physically speaking. Any equivalence of Jesus with God, he said, was nonsense. Jefferson wrote, this is a really important quote, I think, to understanding Jefferson. He wrote that he considered himself, quote, authorized to conclude the purity and distinction of Jesus' character in opposition to the impostures which the New Testament authors would fix upon him. Authorized. He's authorized. And in this confident sense of authority over the text, I think that Jefferson illustrated a vast gulf between those who believe in the Bible's entire God-breathed veracity and those who see themselves as subjecting it to the withering gaze of contemporary academic and elite cultural discourse. So where does all that leave us regarding the role of religion in the founding and among the major founding fathers? I'll offer just a few general conclusions very briefly in closing. One is that the Jefferson Bible shows that even the religious skeptics among the founders knew the Bible surprisingly well. In Jefferson's case, I think we can say that he was nearly obsessed with the Bible and with the person of Jesus in particular. Another conclusion is that even skeptical founders were quick to appeal to God's blessing on a righteous cause when they explained why the American Revolution and independence was warranted. Perhaps some of these appeals were cynical. I mean, these are politicians, after all. Obviously, the Declaration of Independence was not some detached treatise on philosophy. It was a political document meant to motivate Americans to support independence and the sacrifices it would require. And as that kind of document, it brought out the language of equality by our common creation, by God. Finally, the major founders had a wide range of views about specific Christian doctrines, such as the divinity of Christ and the inspiration of the Bible. They were unified, however, in their belief in a created order, behind which stood a creator God. Jefferson, I think, probed the outer limits of religious skepticism before finally settling on his ethics-focused Unitarianism in 1803. But as we see in the Declaration, not even the skeptical Jefferson questioned the idea that the observable world reflected a divine creator. Without a created order and the natural and philosophical rules that came with it, Jefferson's worldview, I think, would have collapsed into chaos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kidd. Thank you all for attending. We're honored to have had you here, and we all learned a great deal. In lieu of a question and answer period this evening, we'd like to invite you all to join us for an event reception here in this building, just down this hallway, in rooms 22, 58, and 60. You can just follow the herd. We're going to quickly usher Dr. Kidd there so you can pepper him with your questions and critiques. But please do pick up a flaming donut on your way. You heard me. That's happening. Once you've got your tasty fire hazard in hand, please keep moving into the room, into the rooms there, where we have bistro tables set up so you can visit and chat through what we've learned. That'll help move the traffic flow quickly through that pinch point in the hallway. We hope, too, that if you have time tomorrow that you'll join us every hour on the hour tomorrow from 9 a.m. until 5, except for that noon hour. We've got sessions in this space engaging these questions of religion and the founding. So we hope you'll join us if you have time. Thank you all for attending. One more round of applause for Dr. Kidd tonight.